You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. Delighted as always to have you with us. Such a thrill, this guest on this episode, as it is our first Vietnam-era veteran to join the podcast. Not only that, he served 20 years in the Marine Corps. He has a Bronze Star with V for Valor device. He has 3 Purple Hearts. And you probably know him most recently for his role in several popular military movies that have come out in recent years. It is Dale Dye joining us on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Dale, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Mark. It's a great pleasure to talk to your audience. Hope we can expound on some things here.
Well, certainly. There's a lot to get to, beginning with your military career. As I just mentioned, our first Vietnam veteran who's on the podcast. And truthfully, it's been hard to find Vietnam vets who are willing to talk about their experience, who are willing to share the things that they went through. But before we get to some of that and why you're so willing to talk as opposed to some others may not be, how did your military career start?
Well, I had gone to military schools most of my young life through the last years of grade school and all of high school. And I went to Missouri Military Academy, and I had hopes of going on to the Naval Academy at Annapolis. Unfortunately, I spent more time playing ball and chasing girls than I did with the books, and I failed the exam to get into Annapolis, not once but several times. And I was kind of at a loss in those days. There wasn't a great deal of scholarship money around, and I certainly didn't qualify for any academic scholarships. And so I was kind of at a loss, and I had been privileged to march in President Kennedy's inauguration parade as a military school cadet in the early 1960s, and I recall distinctly on one wet, snowy evening in St. Louis, sitting on a curb, and I thought about it, and I remembered what he had to say, and the thing that he had to say that stuck with me so distinctly was, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And on that evening, I walked down the street a couple of ways, really wondering what the hell I was going to do with my life. And I saw this poster, this recruiting poster that was sitting out in front of the U.S. Post Office in downtown St. Louis. And it had this Marine in dress blues, and wasn't much verbiage there. He was just this rock-jawed, great-looking guy in blues, and he had his finger pointed out, and it said, ready? And I looked at it, and I said, by God, I think I am. And the next morning, I went inside and enlisted in the United States Marine Corps.
That's incredible because, I mean, Vietnam was on its way when you enlisted in January of 1964. It wasn't like nothing was going on and you were just doing this for yourself. We were already in a conflict that was brewing. Was any of that in the back of your mind when you decided to enlist?
No, I never heard of Vietnam. Never heard of the place. And if it was there, it was on page 14 of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I had no inkling that I might wind up in combat. I just wanted to get in there and join a club, be something more than that guy wandering around on the streets. And so I wanted, I knew the military because I'd been in schools for, something like 7 years at that point, wearing an ROTC uniform. So I said, I want a tough club, and the Marine Corps was it. So I never heard of Vietnam, and in fact, hadn't really heard about it much at all until I got out of boot camp.
And what was the boot camp experience like for you? Did you find that it was giving you everything that you thought you would have?
Well, think Full Metal Jacket, because in those days, that's what Marine Corps boot camp was like. It was very physical, very demeaning. The whole purpose was we're going to break you now, because if you break now, we don't want you anywhere near us in combat. And I got that. I philosophically understood that. That part of it was tough on me. I mean, it was physically brutal, but it was designed to be, and I understood the philosophy of it. And like all young Marines, I patterned immediately on my drill instructors, and so I got through it without too much blood spilled and without too much strain. It was 13 weeks in those days. And once I was out, I was ready to go to work.
Well, work came very quickly, as a year later, in 1965, you had ended up in Vietnam for the first time of your 3 deployments, as I said at the outset. What was that first experience like? What were you told before you left?
Not much. We were actually on Okinawa and loaded up on ships, and we saw live ammunition being loaded, and that was a clue. And then we went down and steamed off the Batangan Peninsula, which essentially was the extent of that, because I had done a little more than 6 months already in my overseas tour on Okinawa. And about Christmas time, they sent me home, so it was not a big deal at all. We heard about little Asian guys in black pajamas running around in conical hats, and it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't until later, really, when I had changed my MOS, my military occupational specialty, and got ready to go for my second tour, that the whole thing, that this was really a war and we weren't playing here, dawned on me. And that was certainly true when I arrived in 67 and led up into Tet 68, where I was with the 5th Marines at that time, and we fought in Hue. And that was a ball buster. That was a meat grinder, and that brought it all home to me in a hurry.
Well, Mark Bowden, who chronicled Hue 1968 in his latest book, was also a guest in the podcast, and he's one of the more notable military writers, author of Black Hawk Down. And, he told us a lot about that particular battle and how much it really, as far as the influence and the way people viewed Vietnam, had a lot to do with it here at home. But for people who are in the whole thing and in the whole mix, I mean, you obviously don't care about any of that because you have bigger concerns to deal with. That second deployment, as you said, the whole thing became real. What was the first thing about it that you remember being so much different?
Well, there were a couple of things. In 67, we were beginning to see large influxes of conventional NVA, North Vietnamese Army regiments. I mean, the days of the little guy in the conical hat and the black pajamas and, World War II weapons was over. We were seeing massive influx of guys who didn't hit and run. They wanted to stay and fight. And so I knew immediately the character of the war had changed. And then I was up at a place called Phu Bai, and we got the word that 8 miles up the road, 8 miles up Highway 1, which is the main north-south access road in Vietnam, that there was this major deal going on in Hue, which was the ancient capital of the Annamese emperors, and really had been sort of a tourist destination, a kind of a backwater R&R site. I said, well, what the hell? That's interesting. And, climbed on the trucks with the reinforcements going up. And by the time we got there and took a look at this place, I mean, it was a city. I mean, it was, it wasn't Chicago or St. Louis or New York, but it was a major city. And across the river from the south side where I arrived was this ancient 1 kilometer square citadel that, reeked of Connecticut Yankee and King Nuyens Court. And we were going to have to take that once we got the south side. And the interesting thing to me, the shocker, and I think to all of us who fought in Hue, the shocker was that we had been trained to fight in the jungles. ambush, counter ambush, meeting engagements, long-range patrols, dense triple canopy rainforest, and that sort of thing. And here we were in the middle of this relatively modern city with weapons. The NBA had taken the entire place, and every round that was fired was triple jeopardy, because not only it didn't have to hit you, it just had to hit some walls or rocks or fences around you, and the shrapnel capacity was tripled, so you could get killed by getting missed.
Wow.
And here we were having to go through these buildings with no training on how to do it at all, really, and just winkle them right out of there. And they were, the defender always has the advantage in things like that, and it rapidly turned into a genuine meat grinder, a really bloody fight, and I think it was a shock to all of us.
Well, and Tet in and of itself and Way lasted over the course of weeks. I mean, it wasn't just like a 1 or 2 day thing. Were you there for all of it, or was Way just a 1 day or 2 day engagement for you, and then you were out of there?
No, I managed to get in and out a couple of times as far as Phu Bai, which was 8 miles down the road. But I was in it for the long haul, along with some buddies of mine, all of them mentioned in Mark's book. And I went from the south side, which was brutal, and then I dropped to another battalion, which was going in on the north side to attack the Citadel. So I was there almost throughout the entire fight.
Dale, in your bio, it says that you survived 31 major combat operations. Is there any consistent theme in how you were able to survive all of those?
Well, it depends on what you mean by survive, I guess. I was there on those operations, and I learned very quickly that very often aggressiveness is your best friend, and I went along and I tried to understand what the mission was and tried to support it in every way I could. I decided, shortly after Hue, that the real key is not to be fearless, because God knows I was +4 pucker factor most of the time, but you really have to learn how to manage that fear. You have to know how to suppress it. You have to know how to deal with it. And when you do that, you begin to think a little more clearly. You're able to manage the adrenaline surge that I think everybody feels when the first round pops by your ear. And I think I just took that experience, which began to build and sort of multiply as I went through more and more of these actions. And I think I just became more professional about it. I just figured it was the nature of the beast, and I was in the belly of the beast for the duration or until they killed me. And so I had to learn to manage fear, and that's kind of what I did.
Dale, as somebody who fought in Iraq twice, I look back at my experience, and there were times I can recall thinking, look, this is hopeless. I'm not sure we're ever going to be able to win this thing. And the losses we took in Iraq, and I was around, my fair share, but, we would get reports and read of this and that incident, and American soldiers getting wounded nonstop and killed. The losses in Vietnam were infinitely larger and just so much more on a bigger scale. When you're going through that whole ordeal, did you ever feel helplessness?
Yeah, I did indeed. And there were times when I just thought, there's no way. I'm just high on the adrenaline of having survived. There's no way I'll survive for the next 15 minutes or so. And there were times, I think every infantryman feels helpless at certain times. But you've got to convince yourself, and that comes with experience, that nothing is really hopeless unless you're dead or you're wounded so badly you can no longer function. You have to be able to say, let's go. I mean, look, you guys have been in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and everything else for 15 years now, rotating in and out. We were in it for about 10 years in Southeast Asia. And some of us did multiple tours. We generally did 1-year tours, or 13 months in the case of Marines. And a lot of us just said, the hell with it. I'll just stick around. And you did that because you knew that if you didn't, somebody else was going to have to, and they knew less than you did, and survived less time than you did, and so you kind of nosed it down and did what needed to be done. I get it when I read stories of firefights in Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, I know. I empathize immediately with those guys and what they're going through. Different war, different environment, different enemy, and different tactics. But that experience, that eternal spirit of the warrior is the same and has been the same since the first guy crawled out of a cave and picked up a rock and went after the next guy. That's one of the things I try to illustrate or show in my films and television projects. We are the same guy at heart and in our gut and in our mind. And that needs to be understood, I think, by the public, or at least I think it does, because if it doesn't, we're doing a great disservice to the men and women who wear our uniform and put their lives on the line.
You talk about the warrior spirit and the mentality of it, and one thing I can't empathize with, look, I went to Iraq, they gave me a Kevlar helmet, they gave me body armor, they gave me knee pads, arm pads, gloves, everything else, all the protection I could muster to at least make me feel somewhat secure. Everything I know about Vietnam, and my stepfather was there, and every picture I've ever seen, you guys had none of that. You had a helmet. It was basically a baseball helmet you were wearing. Yeah, I mean, I can't fathom the idea of combat with nothing on other than a pistol, like other than a gun. Like, it just, to me, I didn't grow up in that army, so it's so foreign. That never came into your mind and go, this is all they're going to give us to protect ourselves is an M14 or an M16 in that matter?
Well, we didn't know about sappy plates and stuff like that. I mean, we sometimes we had a flak jacket, and Lord knows nobody was going to take enough pity on us to give us elbow or knee pads or a Kevlar helmet or something that would access NVGs and things like that. That was, we didn't know it was there, so we didn't miss it. Yeah. What we understood was that this was the same kind of gear that guys carried in World War II and Korea. So, I mean, they didn't have any of that protection. So why the hell should we? I mean, had we known it was there, had we known it was available, had military technology advanced to the point where this stuff was there but we weren't getting it, that would have been a different story. We didn't miss it because we didn't know that it was available for anybody to have. I mean, you guys had a little bit better luck of the draw, I think.
Yeah, to say the least. There is no luck or draw when it comes to combat, but yeah, at least we were better equipped from that standpoint. Dale, you've been awarded the Bronze Star with V for Valor, and for those civilians out there listening, it's not a Medal of Honor, but it's damn near close, and it's one of those awards that they don't ever hand out capriciously. It's a lot goes into the people who get this, and they don't hand out a lot of them. Would you be okay with sharing that story on how you earned yours?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I'm always a little uncomfortable about talking about it, but it was on an operation called Ford, like the truck or the car, and we were chasing a battalion of North Vietnamese Army troops who had been pushed by another unit right up toward the South China Sea, and they were waiting on boats to come and evacuate them to get them out of this trap that they were in. What we should have known at that point was that the NBA didn't react well to traps, and they dug in and decided to fight it out to the end. And so we came up on them and hit them head on, and they were dug in hard in bunkers and well armed and carrying a lot of ammo. And they sort of, as we moved south, they sort of hit us in the left flank. So the whole battalion was turned. This was 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines at the time, and the whole battalion was turned to the left, and we faced these guys. And as we moved up toward them, a Marine hit what was called a frag in a can, or a fragmentation hand grenade that was in a C ration can with a tripwire rigged. And he hit it, and I was about 3 people back from him, and when it went off, and it just tore him up badly. And so I went up and dragged him out of there and tried to keep him alive until we could get a corpsman up. He was a guy by the name of Wilson, and we kept him alive until we got a helicopter in, but he died on the helicopter. But I was under some intense fire as I went up forward to drag him out of the line of fire. And then we moved on into contact with the NBA that were dug in. And, being Marines, it was hey diddle diddle right up the middle. We just went right at them. And unfortunately, I got myself trapped out, or pinned down, I guess is a better word, out in front of the whole line of advance. I'm not sure how that happened, Mark, but there I was. And I was out there with a machine gunner, and we had some dead laying around us, and literally the rest of the company had pulled back to a line of dunes, and we were out 50, 75 meters ahead of them, and we couldn't get up and get back. So I decided, what we got to do is fight our way out of this, and I crawled over to a dead man who was carrying a bunch of machine gun ammo, and I stripped it off of him and brought it over to the gunner, and we began to open fire on the enemy that were in the bunkers. And I was throwing grenades, firing my .45. I was doing everything I could think of to try to get us the hell out of this situation. And as it turned out, our fire destroyed a couple of bunkers and was, was effective in allowing the rest of the company to advance under our fire. So they got up past us and went in and took down the rest of the outfits. So I'm forced to say that it was sort of a dumbass accident, but there we were, trapped out there, and the only way to deal with it was to fight our way out of it. And I was very privileged that the commander of the battalion had observed that particular action and decided that I rated a decoration for it, and he put me in for it, and the commanding general of the Fleet Marine Force approved it, and there it was.
2 questions for you. One, when you were firing at the bunkers and throwing grenades and everything, doing everything you can, was your intent to fall back to where the company was, or were you trying to continue to push forward at that point?
No, I wanted to get the hell out of there. But I had been wounded, and the machine gunner had been wounded also. And we knew we weren't going to be able to do the pick up the gun and hightail it to the rear deal. So we just, I had absolutely no intent on advancing any further than about 4 inches. And I don't think my gunner, a guy by the name of Daryl Beebe, who was with me at the time, I don't think he had any intention of moving anywhere either, except to the rear. But we were just trapped. We couldn't go forward and we couldn't go back. And so we just decided to, put out a curtain of steel if we could, and if a miracle happened and the sky opened up and the angels came down and said, "You guys are okay," then we'd run the hell to the rear. But that wasn't going to happen that day.
Second question: the guy who was injured that you were helping. You're an infantryman. You have some basic life-saving techniques that you're trained on, but what sort of things was he dealing with that you had to do until the corpsman got there to try to keep him alive?
No corpsman was going to come anywhere out of, well, you're talking about the guy who got hit by the frag in a can.
Yeah, that guy.
Look, the fragmentations opened him up like a piccolo. I mean, what I was trying to do, and I hope this isn't too colorful, but
no, all the detail the better.
his sinuses in his face and had all been opened up by frag, and every time I tried to breathe into him, the air would whistle out through those openings, and so I had to poke my fingers into the frag wounds, you know, kind of play him like a piccolo and breathe into him. And that was really about all I could do for him. I didn't have a Unit 1. The corpsman had, you know, the medical pack. All I had was a battle dressing, and I didn't know how the hell that would cover the places he was open and bleeding from. I just knew that at this point, because of my basic combat first aid training, I knew that I had to get air into his lungs and then worry about the bleeding. I had to keep him alive. And when the corpsman came up, of course, then we switched off. You know, I would do closed chest on him, and the doc would breathe into him, and then one of us would puke, and the other one would switch off, and we tried to we kept him alive until the helicopter got in.
It's just utterly amazing, and thank you so much for sharing the story. And, you know, for those, again, listening, as Dale said, a lot of people who have received awards aren't comfortable because it's not what we do it for. I mean, we do the things that Dale did just because it's what our job entails. It's what any of our other buddies would do for us, and none of us do it with the hope that we'll be recognized for it. You do it to save a life of a guy, your battle buddy, whoever it is in combat with you. So I sincerely appreciate you taking the time to share that with us.
Yeah, I mean that's it's that relationship between you and the guys on your left and your right, which really is love. And you know, you can say what you will, but that's what it is. And it's those kind of things that I always thought were missing in the depiction of us in motion pictures and television. And so when I got into that, those were the things I tried to teach. And then by teaching, hopefully they would convey them on screen. And I think in some instances I did that.
When you look back at your Vietnam experience, because your military career, you know, lasted longer than that, do you look back and go, it's just a miracle I survived?
Sure. I mean, to this day, there are, you know, after some bad nights, I'll get up and pinch myself and say, Jesus, did I really survive that? And the neat thing about it is you realize, because you are alive, that you did survive it. And you realize that it really built your life. It gave you the character to survive virtually any adversity. I mean, life sucks sometimes, and you know, we all know that. We've all been through those things. But if you're able to reference back to those times and those moments, it tends to suck a little less, and I think that gives you strength to go through. And that's the character that surviving combat experience, I think, builds in men and women who are fortunate enough to survive it.
So after Vietnam, you end up going to officer candidate school after 13 years in the enlisted ranks, and you get appointed warrant officer. You later become a complete officer and a captain. What was the reason that you made those decisions in your career? I mean, you were a master sergeant. You were the second highest enlisted rank there is. Why the career change, so to speak?
Well, it wasn't entirely voluntary. At that point, in 1975 or thereabouts, the war was winding down enormously, and the Marine Corps and the Army and the Navy and the Air Force and everybody else was trying to get back on a non-wartime footing, kind of trying to broom out some of the bad apples that they had been forced to take by wartime personnel demands and that sort of thing. And I was stationed at the 1st Marine Brigade out in Hawaii at the time. And, you know, I was happy as a clam. I was a master sergeant and, you know, the next step up, and I was as high as you're going to go as an enlisted man. And I had some really good officers who had served with me in Vietnam or who knew of me and knew of my record. And they said, we're going to need a lot of junior leaders who are experienced, not guys out of college, not guys out of OCS, but good, solid, former enlisted Mustang leaders who will help us broom out the bad apples and get back on a footing where we can pay attention to who we are and what we need to do. And I said, oh, yeah, well, that's probably right. And what does it have to do with me? And they said, well, what it has to do with you is that we think you need to be an officer. And I said, well, I don't have a college degree, and I've been going to night school and stuff, mainly because it entertained me. But I don't know that I'm that guy. And I had a regimental commander and a brigadier general who told me in no uncertain terms during a meeting in their office what's called a command performance, while I was at the position of attention, that yes, we think you're the kind of guy who is going to help us, and we want you to do this. You can assume that our want is a directive. And I said, oh, I get it. Aye, sir. And so I submitted my package, and it was promptly approved. And off I went to Quantico Officer Candidate School and the basic school. So it was, I have to tell you, I was honored that they thought that much of me. And it was, it didn't take a whole lot of arm twisting. I got it that I was needed to do this. And I thought, after giving it some, 15 seconds of thought there, standing at the position of attention, that if they really wanted me to do this, if they were really pushing me like this, they believed in me. They thought I could do it. And so that was about all the arm twisting I needed.
It's pretty incredible that it got to the level that it did. I mean, when a brigadier general gets involved, obviously it's a serious matter. But with all that, did you feel different as an officer than you did as an enlisted man?
Not after OCS and the basic school. I mean, I had been 13 years as an enlisted man and an NCO at that point, so I kind of understood officers. I'd babysat sufficient number of them, and junior officers I'm talking about here, and so I got it. I just didn't. I hadn't had the opportunity to lead at that level. And so a lot of the stuff I thought about officers disappeared while I was at Quantico. And I began to think, I began to have these epiphanies, these revelations. And I said, now I understand why they do that. Now I understand where they're coming from when they say this, that, or the other sort of thing. And so it really, I welcomed it. I looked at it as an opportunity to lead on a broader scale, and with more authority and more responsibility than I would have ever had as an enlisted man, even at the top of the enlisted ladder. So I welcomed it. I was once I understood it, I was quite happy with the decision.
If you had to pick one for your entire military career to redo it over again, would you choose enlisted or officer?
Oh, I think I'd go the enlisted route again.
Yeah, I kind of figured.
I really do. It's that's the pointy end of the bayonet, and I like to be up there.
So you finally decide that after 21 years, your military career is over. What was the impetus behind that decision?
Well, the impetus actually was Beirut, Lebanon, where I served in 1982 and 1983. That was my second sort of combat rotation. I was with the 2nd Marine Division and sent over there with the battalion landing team. I had come out of Lebanon. I'd rotated out of Lebanon after about an 8-month stay in the summer of '83 and then in the fall of '83. And I knew from my experience in Lebanon that we were in trouble over there. I knew that we were in a political mission and the politicians were driving the tactics, and I knew that was a disaster, as did most of the Marines on the ground over there, but we just couldn't do anything about it. So in October of '83, when the suicide bomber hit the Marine barracks, which was actually our BLT command post, and killed 241 Marines and some soldiers and sailors, I really had a sort of an epiphany. When I was commissioned, I'll go back to Quantico here for a minute. When I was commissioned, I remember on the day that I had finished OCS in the basic school and I was about to have my bars pinned on my shoulders. And I was shaving that morning, and I looked myself in my own beady ass eyeballs, and I said, look, here's the deal. When the day comes that you can no longer look your Marines in the eye and say, follow me, it is necessary that we die. When that day comes, you should quit. You should quit, because then you're no longer the kind of leader that's required here. And that day came in October of '83. It really sort of broke my warrior spirit, because I knew that had we been allowed to do it the way we knew to do it, and the way we knew was the proper military way to do it, those men wouldn't have died. And I felt that the country in its political leadership had let us down. And that really disappointed me. It really hurt me. And so I was fortunate to have a little over 20 years in at that time, and I was eligible to retire, and I decided, well, I'll do that. Because I don't know if I get another political mission like that, and I have to lead men into combat where lives are on the line, I don't know if I can do it. And so I decided that the honorable thing to do was to walk away and let younger men do it.
I've mentioned Mark Bowden, again, who was a previous guest on the podcast. You know, when he talks about Black Hawk Down, he succinctly describes how, you know, after everything that had went wrong and President Clinton had pulled everybody out the next day, that angered so many more troops there than anything, because they wanted to go back and finish the job. They felt like it wasn't done. You know, they even though they got the guys that they were going after,
sure,
the fact that they were yanked out of there the next day was what upset a lot of them the most. And Bowden details that amazingly. And I agree with your sentiment. And we dealt with a lot of that in Iraq too. I mean, you can feel, especially in my second deployment towards the end, you can feel the politics of everything. And at that point in time, it makes it very hard for us to do our jobs. But the point is that, you know, I agree with you wholeheartedly that it's just one of those things where, you know, as you said, we're the tip of the spear, then let us be that. Don't ask us to be a spoon when we're the tip of the spear. And that gets frustrating.
Yeah. The fact of the matter is that the guys who got out after Somalia, you know, I read some of what they had to say. I read Mark's book. And they would probably still be in and serving, you know, had it not been for that enormous disappointment, that political letdown, that political direction. And look, it was there in Vietnam also. I mean, the White House was micromanaging what targets we could hit and what we could do. I didn't know about it at the time. I didn't realize that because I was an E5 sergeant, you know, and I didn't get the sense of those things. I got the sense of those things later when I was an officer and was associating in a bit higher level policy levels in Beirut. So I get it. And we've got to stop that. And I think, interestingly, the current commander-in-chief he may not be experienced in it, but he recognizes it, that he has to leave the fighting up to the military people. And he's done that with Mattis and a number of other people. And I applaud that. I think that's the way to go.
You know, simply put, the disconnect, I think, with politicians is, and what they don't understand and can't understand, because if they haven't been in uniform, they don't know the feeling. But they have to have every single bit as much as intestinal fortitude when it comes to making decision about the men and women they choose to send in battle as the men and women they choose to send in battle. And if they don't, then you are doing a disservice to the people you're leading.
And the way you demonstrate that, if you're a civilian in Congress, the way you demonstrate that is by imbuing the trust to do the right thing and to do it in the right fashion in your military leaders. That's what you do. I mean, look, every commission is given with the advice and consent of the Congress. And so everyone who carries that commission carries the responsibility that's been placed on him by the Congress of the United States of America. And so you have to be aware of that, and you have to be allowed to function with that responsibility on your shoulders. And if you don't, then you're not doing your job as part of the legislative branch.
Perfectly said. Amazingly well said. Let's transition to your movie career at this point in time. So when you get out of the Marine Corps, was there anything driving you to Hollywood, saying, "Look, I want to go help make military movies"? How did that come about?
Well, I was a little bit at a loss. I went to work early for an outfit called Soldier of Fortune magazine, which I thought would maybe capitalize a little bit on my storytelling ability, my journalistic ability. But that rapidly turned into a major training evolution, kind of an overseas military training team. And I spent most of my time in El Salvador, Nicaragua, or El Salvador, Honduras, and Costa Rica, training anti-Sandinista forces. And at that point, we were up against Daniel Ortega and the communist Sandinistas in Nicaragua. So it wasn't really the sort of thing. And then Iran-Contra went down. I'm in the weeds here, so your audience hopefully will understand what that was about.
Yeah.
And those of us who were down in Central America at the time, advising and training troops, kind of had to drop that like a hot potato and get the hell out of there, because congressional oversight was on it and a number of other things. And so I pulled out of there, and then my job was over. And I really didn't know what the hell to do with myself. And so I sat down, one of those introspective evenings, and I said, well, what the hell have I got that, I can bring to the table here? I know I don't want to be a cubicle rat because I'd end up on a bar stool and kill myself in 6 months. And I don't want to be a cop. I've been shot too many times to go out and take a chance on America's mean streets. And so none of that appealed. None of the standard things that retired military guys do appealed to me. And through a long evening of introspection, I discovered that I was a huge movie fan. I mean, I'd seen every military movie there was, I think, and the common denominator was that most of them pissed me off. They didn't get who we were and what we were, how we relate to each other. What is the warrior spirit? They missed all of that. And so I said, well, maybe there's something there. Maybe I can go to Hollywood and unscrew these people. I mean, I had seen, the credit crawls in the movies, and they said they have military technical advisor, and it's, Captain somebody or other, USA retired. And I said, well, if they've got a technical advisor, how can they be so screwed up? What the hell is going on out there? So, with nothing more than a $2,500 limit credit card, I took off for L.A. And I said, I'm going to find out how this happens. Typical Marine thing. When you're ignorant, you can do a whole lot of stuff that people tell you can't do. And so I came out here and started nosing around, and what I discovered was that there was a certain attitude on the part of the, and I'm doing air quotes here, the Hollywood establishment, that nobody who ever wore a uniform could conceivably have a creative bone in his body. If that was the case, you wouldn't, have wasted your time serving your country in uniform. There was actually an attitude like that. And the military advisors that they hired, sometimes were somebody's brother-in-law who did 6 months in the California National Guard and needed a job. I mean, and they woke them up every time they wanted to know which side the ribbons went on, but that was the extent of it. And I said, I get it here. The light was beginning to glow above my head. I said, I see what the deal is. What they need to do is take these actors and train them the way we're trained, so that they understand our attitudes, they understand our relationships, they understand the things, they understand our psychology, they understand our emotional state, they understand the warrior spirit. And so I tried to I ginned that up into a 5-minute pitch. And I tried to make it, and mostly I just got arrested and escorted off the lots. It was
wow.
The deal was, we had made zillions of dollars making war movies without your nonsense. So get lost, kid. And that was essentially the attitude I had. And then the big break came. I noticed a small notice in the trade papers. I had learned by this time to read the trade papers, Hollywood Reporter and Daily Variety and that sort of thing. Essentially it said that a heretofore relatively unknown writer-director by the name of Oliver Stone was going to do a war story, a war film, based on his own experiences as a combat infantryman in Vietnam. And I said, oh, God, here it is. If I can just reach this guy, he will understand what I'm trying to say. And through some machinations that I don't really want to tell you about because the statute of limitations probably hasn't run out, I was able to reach him, and I called him at his home and I said, look, you don't know me, I don't know you, but if what I read is true, you need me, and here's why. And I pitched him. I said, look, the problem with most of the military movies is they're done by people who don't get what you and I get from personal experience. So if you'll let me train your actors to be who we were when we were 19, 20, and 21, they will just make this movie sing. And he said, I think you might be right. So we had a meeting and we sniffed around each other, like a couple of dogs. And he decided that I was his guy, and I decided he was my guy at the time. And he gave me 33 actors, including some great actors that who weren't anything at the time: Johnny Depp, Forrest Whitaker, Tom Berenger, Willem Dafoe, Charlie Sheen. And he let me take them for 3 weeks into the jungle mountains of the Philippines and make them live like we lived. And I developed a training schedule for them, and I treated them like we were in combat. They only slept a couple hours at night. They only ate twice a day, unless they pissed me off, and then they only ate once a day. And they carried 65, 70 pounds on their back, and they lived like we did. They dug their holes and they lived in them, and that was, and they took a dump between their combat boots, on the blade of an E-tool, just like we did. And so and when I brought those actors down out of the mountains, they were us when we were 19 and 20 in Southeast Asia. And it showed. And we put that little $5 million film together and we brought it home. And it won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director for Oliver. And he was kind enough to acknowledge my major role in it. And so a lot of what I had been trying to tell people was now verified. And the neat thing about it for me was that, we were on this major publicity swing because everybody wanted to talk about the movie that won Best Picture and so on and so forth. And what I realized at that moment was that we had done something more than just make an award-winning picture. We had done something through the medium of motion pictures, film, and television that actually changed society. We had melted some of the ice that had existed for 10 years, for a decade, between returning Vietnam veterans and the society they fought for. That ice was beginning to melt. People were beginning to go to that movie and say, here's why I won't talk about it. Just look at this movie and you'll understand. And it was magic. I realized that I had lightning in a bottle here. And the fact that the movie had been so successful, all of a sudden, all those people who were throwing me off the lot a year ago were now calling me and saying, listen, we want you to work on this film, that film, and that film. And so that was onward and upward. Nothing succeeds like success in Hollywood.
You mentioned the reconnection with Vietnam veterans and America in general and all the other stuff and how hard it was for them to talk about it. And we touched on that at the top of the podcast. Why is it so hard for the men who fought alongside you to tell the story that they have? I mean, for those who survived, those brave lucky ones were able to get out of it all, why is it so hard for them?
Look, unless you are very articulate, unless you have a way with language, both written and spoken, you find it very, very difficult to describe the indescribable to audiences who have no clue, who don't even have a basic common denominator with that experience. And so you can butt your head up against a wall and you can revisit all those painful places and try to explain it, or you can just sort of shrug it off and move on, like the people did after World War II, for instance. And that's been the way that most veterans have gone. Now, there are those who have some facility with language, who've written books and so on and so forth. But they don't stand up in front of people and talk about that experience much. Because it's a bit painful, yes, especially if their time in service involved close combat and that sort of thing. And because it is so very difficult to describe when you've got an audience who doesn't speak the same language, in essence. And so I realized that. And I said, well, I happen to be facile with language and with storytelling. And so I've got to use that talent to bridge that gap. And I've done that. I mean, I've done it in motion pictures. I've done it in television. I've done it in public speaking and acting, in writing books, because I feel that's my final obligation to my oath as a military officer and my duty to the nation. I feel it's my responsibility, since I can, to explore those things and to try to explain them and to try to build a common language between the folks who've worn the uniform and, seen the elephant and heard the owl and those who haven't. I think that's vital for our nation. I think there is, to this day, a disconnect, especially now with the all-volunteer force. I think there is a disconnect between the people who serve the nation in uniform and the nation that's served. And I want to help bridge that gap in any way I can.
When you see the way the military members are treated today, they get acknowledged at sporting events and they're brought to the State of the Union and, everywhere you turn, there's somebody celebrating the military and what they've done. Is there any resentment? And listen, let me caveat it by saying I think it's fair.
Off.
Yeah, I mean, it would be totally fair from your point of view because you guys were so ignored. But what are your thoughts?
Well, initially it pissed me off. And I said, I find myself saying, where the hell were you people?
Right.
And then I back off and sober up for a minute, and I say, wait a minute. If there's one bright element, one bright side to the way we were treated, it's that America recognizes it, is a little bit chagrined, a little bit ashamed of it, and has made a commitment not to ever let it happen again. So we had to be the fall guys. We had to be the scapegoats. But if we have brought about an appreciation for you guys, then so be it. Then we've done something that's helpful anyway.
Well, I say thank you. Again, for somebody who still wears the uniform, when I get my hand shook somewhere and someone says thank you for your service or wants to buy me lunch or whatever, I think about the big picture and everything else, and I'm very appreciative of people who do that. But I'm also cognizant. Again, I told you my stepfather was a Vietnam vet, of a generation of military folks that were forgotten about for all the wrong reasons and all the political reasons that we discussed before, that had nothing to do with anything that people who put the uniform on had to do with. We had to do a job, and it's what we were told to do, and that was it. And we didn't get a choice whether it was the job that we liked or that the American public liked or anything like that. It was a job that you guys had to do, and for that I say thank you for paving the way for folks of my generation who served to actually be appreciated and be grateful for.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about generations, because this new movie that I'm doing in a very non-traditional fashion called No Better Place to Die is a World War II movie. And one of the points I'm trying to make is that warrior spirit is the same with that generation of World War II guys as it was in Korea, as it was in Vietnam, as it was in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I want to use that as a showcase to demonstrate that to the American public. We're doing it in a very odd fashion. We're not doing it in the traditional Hollywood fashion. We're raising money through a crowdfunding source, and we have made a commitment to use as many real veterans in front of and behind the cameras as we can. I want to demonstrate the talent that's out there that are in the veteran community, and I want to showcase that, and I want to demonstrate that lineage, that heritage that you've talked about, that extends from those guys who fought in the ETO, and this story happens to be about the 82nd Airborne on D-Day, who dropped in behind the landing beaches and held the access points so that the Germans couldn't come through and push the Allied invasion forces off into the sea. That's the kind of story, and that's the kind of thing that really needs to be said. And the important thing about it is these were little guys who got misdropped all over the Normandy Peninsula, and they just knew the commander's intent. They knew that they had to take this bridge and causeway, and they had to hold it, or all of the landings might be in jeopardy. So they cobbled it together. I mean, the big plan by the generals, the big hands on little maps, that all went swirling down the crapper. So these guys just came together and said, this is what we have to do, and we, by God, will do it. And that's the same thing we saw in all over World War II. We saw it in Korea. We saw it in Vietnam. We're seeing it today in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria. And I want to demonstrate that. I want to use World War II as the showcase that says, look, these guys who did this at La Fère on D-Day in Normandy are the same guys who are doing it right now today in Helmand Province, or in the outskirts of Baghdad, or overflying Raqqa in Syria. That's what I want America to understand. And Hollywood Hollywood is not going to do it in the traditional fashion, so I'm going the other route. I'm trying to create buzz. I'm trying to create a groundswell of populist support, because I think if our last election demonstrates anything, Mark, it says that Mr. and Mrs. America in flyover country, somewhere between the elitists in New York and L.A., are tired of being ignored. They're tired of not hearing their voice, or not having their voice heard. And it's not only in politics, it's entertainment and all other aspects of life. So I want to capitalize on that. And what we're discovering through our fundraising efforts is that there's a huge populist audience out there that says, yes, we want you to do this. This is our kind of film. This is the spirit of America. This is what we want to see. And so I'm hoping that populist support will attract the big money. They'll say, whoa, wait a minute, that's guaranteed butts in the seats. Let's give these guys what they need to do this movie and capitalize on it. And it's really that simple.
Well, I love the idea, and I applaud your effort, certainly, and I wish you nothing but success as far as the movie is concerned. Look, your military career is heroic. It's one of a kind. Your post-military career is one in a million. But with all that said, I think we're I feel so blessed to have you on this podcast, because with somebody like you, it helps connect a lot of generations and connect a lot of dots that people don't understand. And even for people in uniform, sometimes we even get tunnel vision about our careers and looking forward and forgetting to look back. And I think that's so important. I don't think we do that enough.
I understand that.
So I just wanted to say thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome, and thanks for having me. I mean, You've got an audience of kindred spirits, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to them.
Dale Dye, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Okay, Mark, thanks very much. It's good to talk to you.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.